and welcome to this lecture on how diet impacts your cholesterol levels, as well as therefore how it impacts your risk of heart disease. My name is Lennon. I'm the founder of Sigma Nutrition, and for a number of years now I've been creating educational content around evidence-based information related to diet and health. And one of those big areas around diet and disease relationships is the impact of our dietary choices on heart disease risk. So in this lecture and course, we're going to go through a number of different aspects that hopefully by the end, each of these are something that you will be able to understand. You want to be able to get to a point where we can understand exactly why elevated LDL cholesterol is a problem, be able to explain which of the dietary factors could increase someone's LDL cholesterol, explain what dietary modifications we can make in order to reduce LDL cholesterol and therefore the risk of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, and then be aware of common misinformation on this topic and how we can address such claims in this area. Now, first off, it's important to clarify a few terms that we're going to mention a number of times, some of which you may have heard, maybe some that you haven't, but just so we understand exactly what we're talking about. Now, on the previous slide, you heard me reference atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, or ASCVD, as you might see it referenced in medical literature or scientific papers. Now, this is simply a set of disease processes that are cardiovascular in nature, but specifically relate to this process of atherosclerosis. So atherosclerosis is the kind of formal term for what you might be more colloquially familiar with, this buildup of cholesterol or plaque within the arteries. And so when we think of the term cardiovascular disease, so cardio being related to the heart, but vascular is just as important, and that includes the vasculature of the body, so any disease process we can develop through the arteries. And what is probably the leading cause of some of the cardiovascular events that we're going to discuss is this buildup of plaque in the arteries, and therefore events that can happen off the back of it. Now, this progression of atherosclerosis takes place over a long period of time. So this is not something that just develops immediately after you eat a meal on a certain day or have a certain type of diet for a week. This is something that's developing over years and really decades. And it progresses to a point where we can get much more dangerous complications down the road that could lead to a cardiovascular event, so stroke, heart attack, etc. So what we're really mainly focusing on today in relation to cardiovascular disease is this process of atherosclerosis. Now, of course, there are other things our diet that can affect different types of cardiovascular disease, but our focus is going to be on how diet impacts specifically blood lipids, and therefore how that impacts this process of atherosclerosis. So one thing that this on its surface might seem a bit more complicated, but really what I'm trying to get at with this diagram is a couple of elements. We are looking at the effect of a certain exposure. So with exposure in our case today, it's going to be different aspects of the diet and how that impacts a disease. Now, in any diet and disease relationship, as we see on the screen here, we're looking at the impact of exposure, ultimately ending with an impact on a disease, so the D there at the end. But there's going to be factors that mediate this effect, in other words, that lead to this progression of disease. And so we need to understand what they are. Now, the reason I highlight this is because today we're going to be talking a lot about your blood cholesterol levels or your LDL cholesterol or other measures that you can look at or might get from your doctor's test. And the reason why we're referencing this when we discuss the impact on diet on heart disease is that is the mediating factor. So in our case today, this E for exposure would be diet. The D at the end is coronary heart disease or atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, depending on which outcome we're looking at. And then this mediating variable that's causing this, or the main thing that is driving this increase in risk, is going to be blood lipids, and specifically we're going to be focusing on LDL particles and then maybe more sort of ApoB particles, but we will come to that. So I just highlighted this to understand how we should think about any impact of diet on any type of disease, is that we have this exposure, which is diet, impacting a disease, and there's going to be a mechanism or a way that it's driving that. Now, with regards to blood tests where you would see your lipid panel, and most of you will have got one of these at least with your doctor at some point, and probably quite routinely get this standard lipid panel where you get a blood test done, and it measures a number of different things. In relation to blood lipids, these are the primary aspects that you see back on that sheet where it reports the results. So your total cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, LDL cholesterol. Sometimes you might see this non-HDL cholesterol. You'll also see a number for triglycerides. Now, just on the right-hand side here, shown a suggested level that are typically given for most sets of guidelines. These are not absolute numbers per se, and so we might mention that in some cases going even lower would be better. But these are ranges that we typically see at a cutoff point of normal. So anything above these would typically be flagged as high. And of course, that's on a spectrum. You can go even higher for even greater degrees of risk. Now, a couple of things that you'll note. First of all, most of the time you would have colloquially heard these phrases like HDL cholesterol is good cholesterol or LDL cholesterol is bad cholesterol. And why that is typically used as maybe a useful heuristic for people is that typically a lower LDL cholesterol, the better. And typically you want HDL above a certain level. So you don't want a really low HDL cholesterol level. And this is mainly from associations that we can see in research. And so typically when these things are looked at, you're looking at a HDL, you try to get above this 40, 50 milligrams per deciliter, and LDL cholesterol, really want to keep that down as low as it is possible, but certainly not under these thresholds. So that's why they use the terminology of good and bad, but really it's a bit of a misnomer in the sense of, as we'll come to in a moment, the actual cholesterol that's in any of these types of particles is the same. It's just cholesterol, but it's just in these different types of particles. So what we're really saying as good or bad is how many of these different types of particles do we have, which we're going to explain a bit more in a moment. So those terms, HDL and LDL, they're referring to the density of lipoproteins. So HDL literally meaning high density lipoprotein, LDL low density lipoprotein. We also have some in between those. So we have intermediate density, very low density, and so we have these different types of classifications. Your non-HDL cholesterol is basically total cholesterol minus the HDL cholesterol, so everything else that is left. So this is your typical lipid panel. Let's start making a bit of sense of what these things are and why they are important. Now, first of all, the reason for a long period of time why total cholesterol is being measured has been that there's been associations going way back for decades and decades now, showing that the greater level of total cholesterol in someone's blood, the greater the risk of coronary heart disease and cardiovascular disease events. And so this was pretty routinely found over time, that this greater level of cholesterol in the blood would have this greater impact on risk. So this still is valid, but in the years since and the decades since, and the research that's been done, we have a bit more refined view of what's actually going on. So probably it's not best to focus specifically on total cholesterol. That yes, in most cases, if someone's a really high total cholesterol, they're going to get greater risk. That's probably because of the certain subtypes of cholesterol or types of particles, more specifically, that are carrying this cholesterol around. So we have a more refined view now, which is what we're going to focus on today. This is what brings us to those types of particles I mentioned a moment ago. So again, the details here, don't get too worried or bogged down in these, but here along the left-hand side, we're showing that there's a number of different types of particles that carry different types of fats within our blood. So they carry triglycerides, they carry cholesterol, and these are different types of particles. Specifically, we have different types of lipoproteins. And so, as I mentioned a moment ago, depending on the amount of cholesterol and triglyceride into these lipoproteins, we would have a different density of the lipoprotein, and we break them down as such. So we have high density lipoproteins, low density, intermediate, which are IDL, very low density is VLDL. I think we have these large particles you see at the bottom, which would be large VLDLs or something called chylomicron. Now, again, the specifics for right now won't matter too much, but what we should know is that with these different types of lipoproteins, they confer different types of risk of doing different things, and the ability for them to cause atherosclerosis or be involved in that process is dependent on this size. So what we're showing in this diagram is that what we have here between these two blue lines, if you can imagine, is an artery, and getting into the wall of the artery more specifically. And so you can see that certain particles here, so the ones except for chylomicrons and large VLDLs, you can see all the ones above that are able to get into the arterial wall. So the walls of our arteries, they can move into there. Now, the reason why that's significant is what actually starts that process of atherosclerosis is when we get lipoproteins getting into the walls of the artery and getting stuck in there. Now, we'll see at the very top why HDLs are not typically associated with driving atherosclerosis. They're not involved in that process. They don't confer risk of atherosclerosis, is because they are so dense, they're high density, that they're these small particles that, yes, they can move into the arterial wall, but they can also move out again. And so it's these LDLs, IDLs, VLDLs, LP little a is this other particle that's also implicated here. These are all what we would term atherogenic lipoproteins, meaning that all of these can be involved in that process of atherosclerosis. So really, what is driving your risk of atherosclerosis is how many of these atherogenic particles do you have in your bloodstream around at any one time. And the more that you have over an extended period means the higher the risk of more of those getting retained in the walls of your artery and then starting off that atherosclerotic process. So again, HDL isn't conferring higher risk, but all these other types of particles are doing that job. Now, why do we typically focus on LDL particles? All these atherogenic lipoproteins, the majority of those at any one time in circulation are LDL particles. So about 90% of them are probably LDL particles. So typically, if you have a very high LDL particle count, you are going to be, this is representative of these atherogenic lipoproteins. So again, it's a bit more refined than just LDL, but typically we talk about LDL particles because they are the bulk of these lipoproteins that we know are atherogenic, i.e. causing atherosclerosis. Now, this is just a measure that gets us a pretty good proxy measure, good kind of estimate of the burden of LDL we have. So right now we probably have a better idea that it's actually the number of particles that is more significant. So the total number of all these atherogenic lipoproteins that you have in your bloodstream is more predictive of risk, but LDL cholesterol still is going to be a good sign of that risk in the majority of cases. So where we are right now is whether we look at LDL cholesterol, which we have a bunch of evidence for, or this more refined view of the number of LDL particles, or even more specifically, and probably more accurately, the total number of atherogenic particles we have. These have been implicated to have a causal role in atherosclerosis, meaning by themselves, if you have a high level of these atherogenic lipoproteins in your bloodstream, that is driving atherosclerosis. Now, one term that we may mention and you will hear come up is ApoB, or ApoB-containing lipoproteins. This is simply those atherogenic lipoproteins I mentioned a moment ago. So of all these types of particles that are atherogenic, they have a little particle called an ApoB attached to them. They have one of them on each particle. So if we count up the number of ApoBs, we're getting a number of how many of these particles we have in the bloodstream. And so ApoB is a really strong predictor of risk, and that's the main thing driving this process of atherosclerosis. The more of these particles we have, the greater the risk. So we have this causal role developed that having a high number of these atherogenic particles, the majority of which are LDL particles, is driving atherosclerosis. So as I mentioned, just to kind of clarify some of that terminology, we've said LDL cholesterol is of all those LDL particles specifically, how much cholesterol is within them. Then we can actually measure the number of particles, LDL particles there is, which would be LDL or LDLP you might see on the test. Then we can look at something called ApoB, and this measures the number of all of these atherogenic particles. So not just LDL, but also the IDLs, the VLDLs, the Lp(a). So it measures all of these atherogenic particles, and then that gives us probably the most refined risk. And as I mentioned earlier, the non-HDL cholesterol is just taking out total cholesterol, subtracting HDL. So of all the other types of particles you see on this list, apart from HDL, it's calculating how much cholesterol it's contained within all these particles. So there are some distinctions. Don't get too worried, but we're basically saying that the main causal driver of atherosclerosis is the number of atherogenic particles. The way that can typically be counted is through an ApoB test, but the majority of those atherogenic lipoprotein particles are LDL particles. And so when we measure LDL, we're getting a pretty good idea of that total burden, although in some people there can be what we call discordance, where they might have a very high LDL and normal ApoB, or vice versa. And that's what we're seeing here. There'll be something called discordance, that in a certain percentage of people we might not see an exact matchup between their LDL cholesterol and their ApoB, which is why probably if you're getting the most specific measure for risk, you would get a measure of ApoB, which is counting up all those atherogenic particles we just said. But in the majority of cases, a high LDL cholesterol will show that risk. And particularly if it's really, really high, it's probably very likely that you're also going to have a high ApoB if your LDL cholesterol is sky high. So we've said to this point that elevated LDL cholesterol indicates higher risk. And we could say the same thing for non-HDL cholesterol, because this is the cholesterol contained not just within LDL particles, but also all of those other atherogenic particles. And then more specifically, we've seen that the probably best predictor of risk is going to be the actual number of particles that are in circulation, which would be given by this ApoB. So someone gets an ApoB test, it's going to count up the number of all those particles that are LDLs, IDLs, VLDLs, etc., all of them that are basically atherogenic in nature. Now, why do you put all this? Well, this leads us on to the impact of diet. As we said at the start, the way that diet is going to impact atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease is by impacting these blood lipids. So these particles that we've just mentioned in the bloodstream. So if we can look at what type of factors in the diet can increase or decrease the level of these atherogenic lipoproteins, then we have an idea of what is going to increase and decrease risk of heart disease. Now, by far what we've seen in the research today repeatedly is that of the dietary components, saturated fat has the highest impact on increasing blood lipids. So specifically LDL cholesterol, we could probably say the same for triglycerides as well. So if we focus in on LDL cholesterol or ApoB, the thing that's going to increase that most is going to be saturated fat. And then vice versa, if we are decreasing the level of saturated fat in the blood or in the diet, we can get the decreased in the level of these atherogenic particles in the bloodstream, or a decrease in our LDL cholesterol level, for example. However, the decrease in your LDL cholesterol or your ApoB when you are reducing saturated fat in the diet depends on two things. First of all, your starting level of saturated fat. So if you are on a very high level of saturated fat in your diet, and then you decrease it, you could probably see a pretty large decrease in blood lipids. If your saturated fat is already relatively modest or even within range, then dropping it a bit more probably is going to lead to the same magnitude of decrease as, or same degree of benefit we'd get for someone who has a high level of saturated fat. So typically we're saying you would reduce the amount of saturated fat in your diet if that level is high, and we'll mention a bit what high means in this context. But going from a high level to a lower level is going to reduce the level of LDL cholesterol or ApoB within the bloodstream. But it depends on what nutrient is replacing that saturated fat. So of course, if we take out saturated fat from the diet and remove certain foods that are high in saturated fat, they have to be replaced with something. So depending on what replaces them, that is going to impact the level of blood lipids and also impact the level of risk of heart disease. So specifically, we have almost this hierarchy or an order of the degree of lipid lowering we would get when you take saturated fat out of the diet. So again, let's presume we have a situation where someone has a high level of saturated fat in their diet. They therefore have an elevated LDL cholesterol as seen in a test, or an elevated ApoB level. And now they're going to reduce the level of saturated fat in their diet by taking out some of those foods. Now, depending on what foods and therefore nutrients are coming in to replace that level of saturated fat would indicate how much we expect their LDL cholesterol levels to increase. So this hierarchy starts with polyunsaturated fats. So the biggest decrease we're going to get in LDL cholesterol is swapping out saturated fat and replacing it with polyunsaturated fat sources. So these would be typical things that are mainly contained in a bunch of different plant foods, so that's from nuts, seeds, oils, etc., many of which we're going to come to a bit later when we get the practical food-based discussion. But when we're replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fats, that gives the greatest reduction in LDL cholesterol. If we were replacing that saturated fat with more monounsaturated fats, we would still see a decrease in LDL cholesterol, but that reduction is typically not as sharp, not as pronounced, not as big as we get when we replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fats. Similarly with dietary fiber, complex carbohydrates, we also get a decrease in LDL cholesterol, which is good, but it's not as big a drop as we would get when we replace it with polyunsaturated fats. And then importantly, if we were to reduce the amount of saturated fat in the diet, but then just replace that with refined carbohydrates or added sugars, typically we wouldn't expect to see a change in the risk, because these things are going to be are also implicated in increasing risk in this situation. So we're just removing one thing that could cause a problem and replacing with added sugar, which is just going to increase risk itself. And so the net effect is that there's no reduction in risk. So what we're trying to see with this nice hierarchy, that if the aim is to reduce blood lipids, we can now be more specific in what we're trying to do. We're going to try and reduce some of these sources of saturated fat, and we're going to try and replace them with sources of unsaturated fats and or some dietary fiber. Now, one thing that we know has the biggest determinant of these blood lipid levels is something called the P to S ratio, which is simply that ratio of polyunsaturated fats in the diet to the amount of saturated fats. So P for polyunsaturated and S for saturated. And the ratio between the amount of each in the diet can pretty well predict these blood lipids. And so what we want to do, if we're aiming to reduce the level of LDL cholesterol someone has, we're going to try and increase that P to S ratio. In other words, more polyunsaturated fats and less saturated fat. Now, one other aspect that we haven't mentioned related to nutrients in the diet is the impact of dietary cholesterol. Because, of course, we've talked so far a lot about cholesterol in terms of either total cholesterol or LDL cholesterol. This is cholesterol that is measured in the blood. But we also can consume cholesterol in the diet. And these are the common things people will have associated with cholesterol for many years. For example, eggs are a source of cholesterol, and therefore they are going to, if you eat that cholesterol, that's going to drive up your cholesterol. However, the truth is a bit more nuanced. So typically what's going on is the impact of consuming cholesterol-containing foods, so dietary cholesterol, is dependent on that P to S ratio I just mentioned. So how high your current saturated fat is, or how high your polyunsaturated fat is at the moment, dictates the typical impact you would see of a high or low level of dietary cholesterol. One of the best studies to indicate this was a study from Schoenfeld, which you see this graphic on the screen now indicating. So in a situation where someone has a high level of saturated fat and a low level of polyunsaturated fat, in other words, that P to S ratio is quite low. If we go from having a low dietary cholesterol intake to a high dietary cholesterol intake, we can expect to see an increase in LDL cholesterol. So it's a negative effect. So that higher level of dietary cholesterol, so eating more cholesterol-containing foods, is increasing LDL cholesterol in the context of a diet that's already high in saturated fat. But if we go to the opposite and take a situation where the intake of saturated fat is relatively low, that intake of polyunsaturated is higher, and therefore we have a better P to S ratio, then even going to a higher intake of dietary cholesterol doesn't really lead to a change in blood levels of LDL cholesterol. So in general, if we're doing things quote unquote right in terms of the level of saturated fat in the diet, and we're keeping that within recommended levels, there's probably not need to really worry too much about the level of dietary cholesterol that someone's consuming. Now, there's another bit to nuance here, is that typically foods that are high in dietary cholesterol are the ones that are high in saturated fat, so they're coming together. But if you can keep your overall diet relatively moderate and low in saturated fat, then there's no problem consuming foods that contain dietary cholesterol, because they're going to have minor, if any, impact on an LDL cholesterol. Now, the other nutrient that I mentioned is, outside of these impacts on fats, is dietary fiber. And we see a pretty strong relationship between fiber levels and the impact on LDL cholesterol reduction. So as we increase the level of fiber in the diet, we typically tend to see reductions in LDL cholesterol. So this can range depending on how much you increase fiber by, and also someone's starting point. So again, there's a big benefit to going from low levels to high levels versus already high levels, very high levels. But we tend to see a reduction as someone increases the amount of fiber they are consuming within the diet. There's also specific types of fibers that will have more of a lipid-lowering effect. So for example, you may have commonly heard the advice that often doctors may give someone that has an elevated LDL cholesterol to start including oats, or let's say having some porridge at breakfast. This is because in oats and other things like barley, legumes, they contain certain types of fibers. So specifically oats, we have these things called beta-glucans, which can have an impact on reducing LDL cholesterol. So we're trying to get a overall high level of dietary fiber. It's going to be good. And then looking at these soluble types of fibers that we find in oats, barley, but also things like legumes and plenty of different vegetables and fruits, is going to help reduce LDL cholesterol if it is high. Now, so far we've talked about how does diet impact these blood lipids. So how does diet impact our cholesterol? But the next question someone could come up with is, well, does diet actually have a net impact on cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular events? There's no point in it changing our levels of cholesterol if it's not actually changing our risk in cardiovascular disease. And we have a mountain of evidence at this point. This is just one kind of set that shows you that typically we see, certainly from epidemiology, where we take cohorts around the world, different places, and you look at the level of saturated fat within those diets, and you compare that to coronary heart disease figures and death from cardiovascular disease, for example, you tend to see greater mortality and greater cardiovascular disease events in those cohorts with the highest levels of saturated fat. So this is data taken from a set of country study. Some people may be familiar with that. It's quite a famous study within nutrition science. And we see that, again, when we plot out the cohorts with the highest levels of saturated fat, we see these highest levels of cardiovascular disease, or in this case, coronary heart disease mortality. Now, a good example of this actually comes from a population-based intervention. So in the real world, guidelines being put in place, an intervention at a population level, looking at a situation where there's a high burden of heart disease and a high level of saturated fat, and what happens when we change that. So if we go to Finland in 1950s and 60s, had one of the highest rates in the world for coronary heart disease and mortality. So they had really high levels of heart disease, but they also had really high levels of blood lipids, which was, I think, mainly driving that heart disease. But this was also a population that had a really high intake of saturated fat. So again, when we mention high intakes, anything that is something around, let's say 18% of your total calories or above would be considered quite a high intake. So this was in that range. It was 19 to 24% of the total calories were coming from saturated fat. So this was a cohort of people that had a really high level of saturated fat, but population-wide almost, due to the types of foods that were typically consumed. So lots of butter, lots of fatty cuts of meat, for example. In the early 1970s, the Finnish government then started a public health intervention aimed at reducing heart disease rates. And it picked out four main things that were driving this increase in heart disease and wanted to try and attempt to change it. So one was how we reduce people's overall blood lipids. The second was hypertension, in other words, high blood pressure. Third was levels of adiposity. And then fourth was the level of smoking rates. So in relation to changing blood lipids, that part of the kind of campaign was looked at by saying, well, how can we reduce, in general, people's intake of butter? Because that was the primary source of saturated fat in the Finnish population at the time. It was really common to consume high amounts of butter that was conferring a large amount of saturated fat, and that was driving this high levels of blood lipids that was quite common to see. So they put those in place, and typically we didn't really see much change in those things they attempted to change, apart from these changes in the diet, where you didn't see a meaningful decrease in the level of butter intake, the level therefore of saturated fat in the diet. That's the main thing that changed, and you just see that the levels of heart disease in that Finnish population plummeted over the number of years after this, despite not really making much of a dent in some of those other areas like obesity or smoking. So this was one of the strongest pieces of public health evidence that we have of actually putting these things in place in the real world at population level can meaningfully reduce the amount of heart disease related deaths that we are seeing in the population. World at population level can meaningfully reduce the amount of heart disease related deaths that we are seeing in the population. Now, when it comes to the dietary fat composition of the diet, as you've already said, and from a lipid standpoint of view, in other words, what might lead to the lowest amount of LDL cholesterol or lowest amount of ApoB, and therefore we can presume to have effect, would be changing the levels of saturated fat, and then therefore changing the amount of polyunsaturated fat or even monounsaturated fat. Now, one of the important things that comes with understanding this difference in this kind of opposing impact on risk between saturated and unsaturated fat is that really no longer the emphasis needs to be on the total amount of fat in the diet. So in other words, it's not a high fat diet that is driving this increase in lipids and increasing risk. It's dependent on what type of fats they are made up of. So a high fat diet that is high in saturated fat, yes, is going to be driving that risk in cardiovascular disease by increasing blood lipids. But someone, if they did want to eat, let's say, a higher fat diet, and let's say they prefer eating a lower carbohydrate, higher fat, they could still have a relatively healthy diet from the standpoint of cardiovascular disease if they ensure that the total amount of saturated fat is kept low, And then the majority of the fat they're consuming is from unsaturated fat sources, and they're getting plenty of polyunsaturated fats. Because that way, they're going to have a overall P to S ratio that's good, their overall saturated fat intake is relatively low, and therefore that's going to keep their risk low. So it's not specifically the total amount of the diet or fat in the diet that tells us how good or bad it is. So is a diet high in fat or low in fat? We don't really have enough information there. We need to know what are the levels of saturated fats, polyunsaturated fats, monounsaturated fats, and then from there, that gives us a real idea of where that risk is. So with saturated fat and cardiovascular disease, we're seeing if typically someone's intake is 16% of the calories or more is coming from saturated fat, that is putting them at increased risk. And most guidelines around the world now will suggest aiming for 10% or less of your calories coming from saturated fat. And for someone at high risk of heart disease or in secondary prevention, i.e. they've already had an event, that number might be low than 7% of calories from saturated fat or less. So we have all these things going on that we see. Saturated fat is implicated in driving increase in blood lipids, and that also has been shown that is in turn driving these increased rates of cardiovascular disease. But changing that depends on what we're replacing it with, and the biggest reduction is going to be coming from replacing that with polyunsaturated fats. So if we are getting to the point of saying, well, what are the aspects to achieve a healthy blood lipid profile, i.e. get our LDL cholesterol or LDL particles or ApoB particles low enough that we're at the lowest amount of risk, there'd be a few things from a nutrient standpoint we can mention. We've said we want to have a diet that's low in saturated fat, so typically less than 10% of our daily calories. We want to have most of the dietary fat that we consume coming from unsaturated fat sources, so that mix of polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fat. We want to have a diet that's high in dietary fiber, coming from a range of different things like nuts, seeds, legumes, whole grains, fruits, vegetables. And then we also want to have a diet that's relatively low in free sugars or refined carbohydrate. So again, for added sugars in the diet, we want to keep that below 10% of calories in the diet. Now these are for nutrient recommendations, but then what's that look like in terms of actual foods? Because we've given these percentage of calories, and of course we don't think in percentage of calories doesn't mean anything to us, right? But just to give you an idea of what this might mean, on the left-hand side here, we take different levels of calorie intake. So depending on a person, their needs for calories over a day will be different, obviously, and their total intake on average will be closer to one of these numbers. Depending on the total number of calories, we can look at what that recommended saturated fat intake is, whether we're going for guidelines that are 10% of calories or less, or the more stringent ones for people at higher risk at 7% or less would convert to this actual amount of grams of saturated fat in the diet. Okay, so that's a kind of just a reference point for now. This is what it looks like in terms of grams. And again, what does that look like in terms of actual foods? Well, in terms of some of the foods that are typically highest in saturated fat, we would see things like, again, butter, fatty cuts of meat, processed meats, as well as many of the types of foods we typically classify as being more highly processed. Chocolates, donuts, pastries, things like that are going to contain saturated fat too. And so here, depending on the typical serving size that's listed in our middle column, you can see the total amount of grams of saturated fat on average something like this would have. And again, we can relate that back to something like our recommendations here. So you can see how quickly these would be hit if someone is regularly consuming foods like this, particularly if they're consuming them regularly and in high amounts. So again, doesn't mean we cut all fat out of your diet, but you can go for high fat foods that are going to be low in saturated fat, or certainly different types of subtypes of saturated fat, as I mentioned a moment, and higher in polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats. So again, probably one of the easiest heuristics is if we think of a high fat foods that are plant foods, typically is going to give us that better fat composition than typically be the unsaturated fat sources. So almonds, basically any type of nuts, seeds, avocados, olive oil. We have interesting things going on with dairy. So for example, the impact of saturated fat from butter seems to dramatically increase LDL cholesterol, but the impact of that same amount coming from things like yogurt or cheeses doesn't seem to confer the same level of risk as something like butter. There's some reason why for that, depending on what we call food matrix, the overall composition of food, but that's for another time. But the general idea here is that we can have a diet that still contains fats, but there's probably better choices to consume overall and avoid a high amount of the foods seen on the previous slide. So what does that mean for food level changes? So what we end up needing to do then is, in general, very simply, decrease intake of saturated fat if that's really high. We're going to end up replacing it then with a variety of different healthy foods, hopefully, but typically sources of unsaturated fats and dietary fiber. So what this might look for an individual person, again, there's an almost endless list of things we could do, but just as a very crude example, we could take someone who consumes fatty cuts of meat, so whether that's a piece of steak or whatever that has fat within it or is well marbled, and we're going to replace that either for a really lean cut of meat or perhaps even better some fish. And this even could be some fatty fish like some salmon. Again, it's going to contain lots of unsaturated fats. We have things like tofu, or we can have plant alternatives. So in other words, it's the dinner time having that fatty cut of meat, or there's someone having a vegetarian style dish where they're getting not only some of those plant-based fats, unsaturated fats, but also probably much higher of dietary fiber in that meal. So that's just an example. Swapping from from the fatty cuts of meat to one of these options is going to lead to a reduction in saturated fat, and at the same time is probably going to increase unsaturated fat at your dietary fiber intake. If someone uses a lot of butter on certain foods, putting on their dinner or using it in cooking, is that can be replaced with either an olive oil, or it could be a plant-based spread, something like that. Again, we're going to see that shift in reducing saturated fat, increasing polyunsaturated fat. If someone has something like jerky as a snack quite regularly, swapping that out and having their snack now as a handful of nuts is going to see an increase in that polyunsaturated fat intake that we've had. Also, so things called 5-sterols, which we'll mention in a moment, can also have an LDL cholesterol reducing effect. And so these are just examples of what we might see on a food-based perspective. Going beyond these certain changes, we also have an area in research that we looked at that goes even further for people who are actively trying to get their LDL cholesterol down. Maybe they're high risk, maybe their LDL cholesterol is high and they want to try and get that as low as possible. Maybe they're trying to get that lower before they start looking at other options with their doctor. And one of the things that beyond just changing that P to S ratio and beyond just reducing saturated fat and eating an overall healthy dietary pattern that has been shown to decrease LDL cholesterol is something called the portfolio diet. And a team of researchers based at the University of Toronto have been at the forefront of developing this. And basically it takes a portfolio in the sense of different types of foods that have had associations with reducing LDL cholesterol, typically estimated that each of these additions in the diet could lead to a reduction of 5 to 10% in someone's LDL cholesterol. And the idea is, if we stack these on top of each other, in addition to an already healthy diet that is low in saturated fat, high in fiber, etc., then there's an even greater effect, there's an additive effect of this portfolio diet. So there was typically 4 aspects to this. There's now a 5th, which is the addition of olive oil or other unsaturated rich oils. And previous to that, there was kind of 4 main elements, which was the addition of nuts, plant sterols, viscous fibers or soluble fibers, and soy protein. And typically most of the studies you've seen that given in the amounts listed here, so it'd be 45 grams of some combination of nuts, 2 grams of the plant sterols, which is these plant sterols and stanols you may see in a number of products that are marketed at reducing LDL cholesterol. So there's little yogurt drinks or spreads with these plant sterols added. And these are then functional foods in the sense they've had these things added to them with the aim of reducing LDL cholesterol. So typically in spreads and little yogurt drinks, etc. You could have this viscous fiber, which is in those foods, as we mentioned earlier, like in oats and barley, psyllium husk, etc. That again can particularly have a strong LDL cholesterol lowering effect. And then a variety of different soy-based foods that can give you a high intake of soy protein. That's tofu, soy milk, edamame, or there's even now soy protein, isolated supplements, etc. And so the combination of these things together has been shown to reduce LDL cholesterol to an even greater degree than just a low saturated fat, healthy dietary pattern. So if you're interested more in this and this is something you'd like to look into, there is a website there which you can go and check out more about the work and the research behind the portfolio diet and exactly how to put that in place, but just worth flagging here. So let's finish off by kind of revising over what we said to this point and leaving with hopefully some relatively clear conclusions about, number one, how diet affects our cholesterol levels and therefore how that in turn impacts our heart disease risk, and then what things would increase that risk and what things would decrease that risk. So importantly, we said that despite what you might hear in certain places around the internet, there is a really well-established causing role of LDL particles, or maybe more specifically ApoB particles, in atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. Meaning, the higher the number of these particles that we have in circulation, the greater the risk of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. So despite what you may have heard on the internet, there's a really well-established causal role of LDL or ApoB particles in atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, meaning that the greater the number of these atherogenic lipoproteins are in your circulation, the greater the risk of atherosclerosis, and they themselves drive the atherosclerotic process. And so just having that elevated number of these particles in your bloodstream will lead to greater levels of atherosclerosis. And one of the main ways that we get a assessment or an estimate of that particle burden is through an LDL cholesterol test on a standard lipid panel, although now there are blood tests that will specifically measure either LDL particles or an ApoB particle test, but again, depending on where someone's located and what they have access to. We know there's a really strong relationship between diets that are high in saturated fat and cardiovascular disease, both incidence and mortality. And this relationship is mediated or affected by the impact on blood lipids. In other words, high saturated fat in the diet is increasing risk of cardiovascular disease. The primary way that's doing that is by increasing your blood lipids, i.e. increasing your levels of LDL cholesterol or ApoB containing particles. If we want to try and reduce LDL cholesterol or reduce LDL particles or reduce ApoB particles, i.e. this lipid lowering, by reducing the amount of saturated fat in the diet, it depends on what we're replacing with until there's a clear hierarchy that the biggest reduction in your LDL cholesterol will come with replacing that saturated fat with polyunsaturated fats. So mainly from plant sources of fats or marine sources. So again, taking out saturated fat and adding in plenty of nuts, seeds, olives, olive oils, avocado, salmon, mackerel, etc. We also have an impact of monounsaturated fats, again from plant sources and marine sources. We also have a lipid lowering effect from unrefined complex carbohydrates, dietary fiber, and again, not to the same degree as polyunsaturated fats, but still a meaningful degree, and also has many other health benefits. So including more of these types of food sources in place of high saturated fat foods. The total amount of dietary fat isn't the important thing. We mentioned that it's the subtypes of fat that are more important. So whether someone has a high fat diet or not, don't tell us everything until we know, well, what is the amount of saturated fat, polyunsaturated fat, monounsaturated fat. We said in order to get a healthy blood lipid profile in general, some of the core steps we can take is first make sure the overall diet is relatively low in saturated fat. Most of our fat is coming from unsaturated fats. you have a diet that's high in dietary fiber, so let's say aim for 30 grams per day or more, and then staying relatively low in added sugar within the diet. And then there's also an additional benefit is to walk to even further and reduce their LDL cholesterol even further by adding in those extra components that are part of the portfolio diet. So adding in soy protein, nuts, viscous fiber, and plant sterols in the amounts that we discussed. All of those can have this additional benefit. Now, it's worth saying that in some cases, even doing these things may not give everyone the degree of LDL cholesterol reduction they want. Some people may need to then go other routes to get that down, and obviously that's something they should be doing with the doctor. But these things are a great way to actually start that and aim to get those lipid levels low. Now, one important aspect to also mention is that it's not just how low we get our lipids, i.e. how low we get our LDL cholesterol and ApoB, it's how low that stays over a period of time. So as I said right in the outset, this process of atherosclerosis takes place over decades and decades. So we want to make sure that we keep LDL cholesterol and keep ApoB down over decades and decades, because the risk that it's imparted is not just the amount at any one time, it's what we call a cumulative effect. So the impact over a long period of time. If you want to contact me or any follow-up material related to this type of stuff, you can find my contact details here in any of these places, whether that's through social media or the website, thesigmanutrition.com. There you'll also find additional resources related to this topic. If this is what you're interested in and interested in heart disease in general, we have a bunch of stuff on that, so that might be useful. And of course, if anything here was unclear or didn't make any sense, I'm happy to take questions in any of these places. Here are a number of references, and of course you can go and check more of those out if you want to do further deep reading. But for now, thank you for listening in to this course on diet, cholesterol, atherosclerosis, cardiovascular disease. I hope it's been useful. I hope it sparked up some interest in folks and incentivizes you to go and look into this area a bit more deeply and to learn a bit more about it if you are so inclined. But thank you for watching. Hope it's been useful, and hopefully to see you in another course here with me in ASN.